Morning, Mr. Speaker. Morning, fellow members. Mr. Speaker, the legislative framework in Guyana has to change. It has to be updated and it has to be able to address the challenges and the needs of the country. His Excellency, the President, has emphasized this, that we have to overhaul our nation's laws. The Honorable Attorney General has, up to as recently as last week, emphasized that the legislative architecture of Guyana is now to be updated. We have to reflect in our laws the changes and norms of society, and we can't be stuck in the old ways doing things in the old manner with the old tools when society and times have changed. This bill, Mr. Speaker, addresses a very important aspect of modern society. The police force, how the police force would do their job, what equipment they can lawfully use to do that job, and importantly, how is the use of force treated. At the outset, it should be clear that the use of force by the police should always be proportionate and appropriate. As the saying goes, you don't need to take a gun to a stick fight. Mr. Speaker, we're a Commonwealth country. Centuries ago in England, in the streets of London, policemen were equipped with wooden batons for the first time. The proliferation of the English Empire brought those wooden batons as tools of the trade for policemen. The baton was a weapon of choice in the 1800s. From about 1880, it became part of regulation and law throughout the Commonwealth, and indeed this country too. Guyana had received from England as a colony that policemen were armed with batons. At its inception, it was considered a useful tool and was quote-unquote state-of-the-art for its time. Times have changed, Mr. Speaker. Batons are no longer sufficient. Criminals now possess more sophisticated weapons. The proliferation of guns, for example, have rendered batons insufficient. If policemen are not adequately equipped, Mr. Speaker, they are in harm's way without any protection. Now, Mr. Speaker, in Guyana, policemen can only carry arms that they are authorized by law to do. They can only protect themselves in a way that this Parliament permits them to do. Section 3.3 of the Act empowers a minister to permit members of the force to carry arms. And by Section 54 of the Act, it is mandated that those arms are to be provided to members of the force at public expense. In essence, Your Honor, this Parliament directs what can be carried by a policeman in the course of his duty and provides it to that policeman so that he can effectively carry out his duties. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice in the United States, in its winter edition of 2010, focused a lot on the use of lethal and non-lethal weapons. Non-lethal weapons have been found by research that non-lethal weapons being carried and authorized to be carried by the police force allows for every opportunity that greater force not be used. So proportionality of response becomes easier to access to a policeman and easier to quell whatever situation the officer faces. The reduction of the carrying of non-lethal weapons has led by research of that same organization to greater and an increased number of a decreased number in the use of lethal force. If you have less officers employing lethal force, Mr. Speaker, it is very likely you're going to have less lethal injuries. This was recognized as far back as 2010. Mr. Speaker, the world has recognized that it is vastly different now than it was a mere 15 years ago. Batons are insufficient. Guns are the other end of the scale, Mr. Speaker. What we have is if we have batons, which are clearly insufficient, we have guns, which are the other end. We do not have in Guyana as yet to fill that void non-lethal weapons which can be employed to great effect. In 1990, Your Honor, it was recommended by the United Nations that there be developed, and there was money spent and research undertaken to fill the void between a baton and the fire and a gun. So non-lethal force became something for which resources were being expended so that you can have a full spectrum. The idea is do not get to the final option as a second option, because if you only have a baton. So the idea is to get to the final option after you have exhausted your other options. Now, that was basic principle number 2 of the United Nations in its research. But in Guyana, Mr. Speaker, we have to authorize policemen to carry devices and weapons for non-lethal force. And we have to train and equip them. That is why this Parliament must give that authority. Without it, the minister and the policemen are powerless to carry anything otherwise. Now, basic principle 3 of that same United Nations declaration recommended that research be done into an evaluation, which was undertaken by that body. And it was discovered that in many cases, you have policemen of different experience and ranks. And it would be appropriate that policemen with certain duties and of a certain rank can effectively conduct their duties by using or by having at their disposal non-lethal weapons, as opposed to senior ranks, which might be more to be trusted. I hate to use that word in the sense to differentiate, but they would have more experience and would be able to deploy lethal force. In 2014, the Human Rights Council, Mr. Speaker, made it known that guidelines had been developed for the use of non-lethal force, and those guidelines were found to be very effective at de-escalating situations to where lethal force was required. Mr. Speaker, we can't escape from the realities of what Guyana faces. We cannot escape that we would like better policing. Now we have to equip the policemen with better tools. We have to make it so that the widest range of tools are available to policemen. Their equipment must be such that it allows them the widest spectrum of resources to adequately perform their duties. To restrict them to only a clearly insufficient baton and the next step to be a firearm, Mr. Speaker, that would not be adequate, and that would only give them limited options. It is not every situation, Mr. Speaker, that requires lethal force. This bill specifically addresses that lacuna and the diverse range of matters that the force should be able to address. It allows, this amendment, Mr. Speaker, allows the minister to provide the police with adequate tools to meet the events and situation of Guyana at present day. Mr. Speaker, I therefore fully support this bill as proposed by the Honorable Minister of Home Affairs.